Congressman Sestak, welcome to Radio Smart Talk.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Scott and Scott.
Congressman, this is Scott Detrow. We spoke earlier this week about Afghanistan, and I just wanted to start off by getting you to elaborate on something you said earlier, in that both you and Senator Specter agree on this fact that really Pakistan has become the central front for fighting al-Qaeda. A lot of leaders, including possibly Osama bin Laden, are in Pakistan, not Afghanistan. That being the case, talk about what you think the strategic value of being in Afghanistan is right now.
Absolutely, and thank you. And it's also why I'm pushing strongly to have an exit strategy provided by the president. In fact, I've written him a letter today. This morning I finished it, so that we can measure our progress towards doing it. A withdrawal beginning in 18 months is interesting with regards to Afghanistan and telling the government there that we won't have an open-ended commitment. But I want an exit strategy so that we can measure our progress of being successful to destroying the al-Qaeda safe haven in Pakistan. Now, how do we do that? Well, we have covert forces. We also have trainers with the Pakistani forces. But more than anything else, it's our partnership with them. There are 25,000 radical Taliban in Pakistan. And if we aren't present in Afghanistan, those 25,000 Taliban will escape across the border. And Pakistan, without us there, that has historical ties in through the intelligence agency to Taliban, will start being quite wary if we're not there for the ability to make sure that we are staying long enough that they will destroy the Taliban on their side of the border and then eradicate al-Qaeda with our covert assistance and our training for them towards a counterinsurgency effort. In short, the objective the president talked about of a Pakistan-U.S. partnership is why this is most important part of the strategy.
We're talking with Congressman Joe Sestak, who is a Democrat running for the U.S. Senate from Pennsylvania. If you have a question or comment, 1-800-729-7532. That's 1-800-729-7532. Or email us at smarttalk@witf.org. Just so we can provide some background for our listeners, Congressman Sestak, you do support the president's plan, though, for the surge, correct?
I do. But he hasn't provided us the exit strategy yet, which I caveated in my support for it. He did give us some draft metrics in September, but I want the final ones so that we can measure our progress, because if you don't know what the metrics are to measure your progress, how did you know how many assets you needed to walk through it? And we don't want to have an open-ended commitment. Look, the key here is this. Having been on the ground in Afghanistan, head of the Navy's anti-terrorism unit, having watched this very closely as I'm probably the only member of the Senate or House of Representatives that served in the White House, the National Security Council, and also head of Navy's anti-terrorism unit, my issue is others say they can go elsewhere. But if we leave these al-Qaeda in that safe haven where they can plan quietly and Pakistan becomes a failed state, because this is really about Pakistan, not Afghanistan, where they have 2,000 scientists who have access not just to the knowledge of how they built nuclear weapons, but the radioactive material, and Pakistan fails, then we have a greater potential for cost and consequences to harm America several years from now.
Congressman,
so my issue is, yes, we must be there because of Pakistan.
Congressman, with that military background, can you explain to listeners what, in your mind, that extra 30,000 troops, what that can really do to transform the mission we're doing now, how it can improve the U.S.'s performance there?
Absolutely. And please, and my background is also foreign policy. I mean, the diplomatic portion of it from the White House also, because this is really about the art of the possible, because militaries don't fix problems. They only stop them for a while. With these troops there, as the president said, that I support President Obama in this, is that there are 20,000 Taliban in Afghanistan. 70% of them are there merely for a wage. So there's about 6,000 Taliban that need to be neutralized. By providing security as its first objective for the major population centers, it permits us time to train the Afghanistan military, yes, but also primarily to get the tribal chiefs and local governing officials with their, frankly, they have supporting militias, to become the type of stable force there. In the meantime, as Pakistan is intent of moving from South Waziristan on its side of the border into North Waziristan, where the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and others are, we, so to speak, close the door so that they can decimate those on the other side. But in the interim, truly the best thing you could do for global war of terror in the longer term is to fix, for example, the illiteracy rate of women in that area of the world. However, because of that tragic vote that the Senate and the House Representatives did for President Bush of sending us to Iraq, we can no longer nation build. That's why I say it's not just about a withdrawal beginning from Afghanistan to talk to the government. We need an exit strategy that shows how successful are we in giving some stability to Afghanistan so the Al-Qaeda won't find a hospital place there when we depart, but truly to helping Pakistan continue on its mission of saving itself, yes, but eradicating the Al-Qaeda and the radical Taliban that protect them on their side of the border.
Congressman, you've said before that you don't really trust the Karzai government at this point. You think they're very corrupt, and you've talked about building partnerships with more regional power brokers, warlords. And I want to get into what you just said a minute ago, and you've talked about previously, about partnering with those, as you say, more moderate parts of the Taliban, the Talibanis who are there more as kind of mercenaries than there as ideologues. Can you talk about that? Because some people at first glance would kind of raise their eyebrows and say, I don't understand how we could see the Taliban in any sort of legitimate role in Afghanistan given their track record of a very harsh rule and abuse.
Well, remember, I don't believe we should at this extent because of that tragic vote so many people gave to go to Iraq. We had a chance to rebuild that nation, but not any longer. And remember, before we went into Afghanistan, President Bush said, Taliban, kick out Al-Qaeda, we won't come in. So my issue is we're only in Afghanistan not to nation build any longer. We're only there to make sure that Pakistan helps finish the job of Al-Qaeda's where the leadership, the planning, and the execution against America is done. We just want to leave some semblance of stability behind in Afghanistan because of that tragic misadventure of Iraq. It has spiraled so far downward that we don't want to have any reliance upon the central government of determining when we depart. It's only about the Al-Qaeda that threatens America now, and that's the only reason to be there. And therefore, tribal chiefs, warlords, those types of Taliban, 70% of which are actually there for a wage, that we want to have them provide the modicum of stability as we depart. It's Al-Qaeda and solely Al-Qaeda that we want to make sure is eradicated. And that's why we need an exit strategy of benchmarks that measure success so that we know when we're going to exit and the public can know, and failure so it can trigger an alternative approach, which might be to do it from a longer distance, which everyone knows is less good when you're trying to deal with Al-Qaeda. Because if a safe haven means they can quietly plan at a time and place of their choosing, but if you have some boots on the ground like the Pakistanis going after them, they then have to move, communicate, get logistics in a different area, and our eavesdropping can pick them up and, to use a military jargon, pickle them. In the meantime, we leave behind some semblance of stability and have an exit from Afghanistan. It's not about Afghanistan. It's the Al-Qaeda that could harm us. And others say they could go to Somalia or Yemen. The president says we'll go after them there, but we know their leadership, who the planning is there right now. And what if we leave there and 5 years from now they are left to safely plan against us and Pakistan fails and they now have control of the nuclear material in that nation?
Congressman Sestak, the Iraq situation is certainly frustrating, but unfortunately it's done and over with. But looking at something that did happen in Iraq, when the tide started to turn in Iraq, other than the additional troops, was when some of the insurgents started to come over to our side. They were tired of working with the insurgents, working with Al-Qaeda, and they saw that there was really no future in it. And I'm trying to find out, to clarify, if you're talking about kind of the same thing with the people with Taliban that aren't as, as ideologues as you had described.
Secretary Gates has said that there is a rough parallel to this, that it's a very rough parallel, because when we went in, we were quite welcomed in Afghanistan, and the people, every poll, believe it or not, shows, as Secretary Gates testified for my committee yesterday, shows that the Taliban are not welcome there. Those there for ideology. But what we're talking about is that country has primarily been ruled by tribal chiefs and warlords, and that was good for us before 9/11, and it's good for us at this stage of the game afterwards, as long as they don't welcome al-Qaeda back. And that's why the emphasis on the Taliban in Afghanistan isn't really our focus. Many of them are, for example, Tajiks. There's a Tajik warlord who joined up with the Taliban. He's recruited Tajiks from Tajikistan who used to work in the oil fields of Russia, believe it or not. In this recession, hundreds of thousands of young Tajiks have been sent home, young Muslim men with no wages, and so they've joined the Tajik warlord who works for the Taliban. That's what I'm talking about, is that if you can, as this surge in civilian support, which is important, helps them understand that there will be wages elsewhere, you've weaned 70% of the Taliban back. Then you've got the tribal chiefs, the local warlords, because we can't fix a corrupt, inept government any longer. Meantime, our partnership with Pakistan is about getting rid of al-Qaeda that sits there. People say, oh, they'll go elsewhere. No, wait a moment. We know some bin Laden is there. We know Sarawi is there. We know who's there. And we know it's a few hundred. A fatal blow may be dealt in this time, but leaving them there with Pakistan close to failure, where their intelligence and military have ties into the radical Taliban, and we were to depart today, that would mean that they would spread their bets once more and maybe become a failed radical state. That's the danger. But if this president must provide an exit strategy, because if it's not working and the cost becomes more than the benefits, and we didn't have an exit strategy for Vietnam, we didn't have one for Iraq, to where we can measure it. They promised us one in March. They gave us rough metrics in September. We need the final one so we know if we're being successful, because the cost can become more than the benefits, and that's when you do your exit. Notice that this is the issue that I'm most about. I was opposed to Iraq, but al-Qaeda is who planned against us are there, and we have a small opportunity to see if we can eradicate them at much lower cost than several years from now.
Congressman Joe Sestak.
People who's on the other side of this issue very much.
Congressman Sestak, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for the time on such an issue that does affect us. And I know that there's different opinions, but I felt I should be honest and forthright from particularly my experience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman.